Hello and welcome to this edition of Insights and Sounds. I'm Martin Preston. I'm a PhD researcher at University of Bristol's School of Education. We're very fortunate today to have with us Frances Giampapa, a senior lecturer in education focusing on TESOL and applied linguistics. She's the director of the EdD programme at the University of Bristol's School of Education and is the coordinator of the Language, Literacies and Education Network. She uses a linguistic ethnographic approach, and her research focuses on migration, language and identities nexus across multilingual contexts. Hi Frances, welcome.
Hi Martin, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to have a chat today about my work and the things that kind of really drive the passion that I have for my research.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really looking forward to hearing you talk about your work. So in your upcoming paper with Alicia Fernandez Barrera, you draw on the case of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain and a period of rapid bilingual transition in a bilingual program. I wondered if you could talk about that context, your own research in that, and your findings, etc.
Yeah, sure, Martin. I mean, it was called the epiglo project. We love acronyms as researchers, but it was certainly kind of focusing on two sites actually in Spain. One was in Barcelona and one was in Castilla-La Mancha, in schools within the region of a city in Castilla-La Mancha. And Alicia and I were working in various schools there. I was an international researcher attached to the project. And I've always been interested in language and the role of language in shaping identities and the ways in which language ideologies start to kind of position speakers in particular ways. So if you don't have the right form of English, for example, with the right accent, you're kind of positioned as sometimes a lesser valued user of English. You're kind of, you know, there's a hierarchization process that goes on. And what's been happening in Spain in the last decade or so, or more actually, is this real kind of thirst and drive for becoming bilingual. So the learning of English, because the learning of English is tied to an ideology of educational success, of having future employment, and it's all of these different things tied to, you know, a country's educational policy, and being competitive, and it's all this kind of also neoliberal discourse that unfolds that's tied to the globalizing of English. So what we were quite interested in is looking at the ways in which that was impacting on schools and institutional structures, and how schools in that town, in that city, were all, in a sense, trying to become bilingual schools, offering bilingual programs to Spanish families. And what being bilingual actually means was tied to a lot of these other discourses around educational success, around mobility, social mobility, and so forth. And what also happened was this kind of change, a kind of hierarchization of schools as well, of competitiveness, of schools getting, you know, trying to sell these bilingual programs through having native language teaching assistants, so having the native speaker, and I put that in inverted commas because often that's a loaded concept as well. The belief that, you know, being a native speaker gives you much more power in terms of the teaching of language, which isn't necessarily the case, but that's how they were selling it to their families. So a lot of parents were believing that, you know, this was really important for their children to be part of a bilingual program. But what also happened was the fact that it wasn't equal for everyone. So you take an example of a school that perhaps changed its profile. So it became offering a bilingual program also kind of reproduce certain inequalities in the school. So the students that were becoming, that were entering these bilingual programs were often the more successful students. They were more high achieving students. And it was also dividing the teachers in schools as well. So in some of the cases, one of the cases that we talk about in the paper, teachers were able to become part of the bilingual program and schools were able to offer it if they had a certain level of English, right? So again, there started to be also a division amongst teachers, a re-ranking of teachers in a sense. And a privileging of, or at least a perception from, you know, teachers who didn't have a certain level of English to be able to teach on that program, felt that they were kind of professionally losing out on something. So it was quite interesting to see the politics around this in schools and in the city, hearing from students, parents, and our focus in the paper, as you point out, is around the teachers. And we had 2 teachers that we focused on, Elsa and Esteban, we called them, and they were interesting to us because of their own experiences, their own personal experiences in relation to the learning of English, their own personal trajectories, their professional, how that impacted their professional trajectories as well. So for me, having done actually my own kind of research on language and identities, as you've pointed out, my interest has always been around language ideologies and how that shapes people's identities. And identities as a concept for me comes from a post-structuralist view of identities as multiple, as accomplished through interactions. Relations of power are tied up in that as well. How we self-identify, but also how others position us in terms of our identities, also either opens up opportunities or closes down opportunities in terms of educational opportunities and in terms of our own access to material and symbolic resources. So I kind of have a more sociological kind of conceptual tranche to my work. So that my earlier work, which was really focused on student identities, kind of led me also to think about the role of teachers in all of this as well. So I started kind of looking at teacher identities when I did my postdoc in Canada many years ago. And I started working in Canadian schools that were very multilingual, but were mainstream English schools. So the discourses are always around monolingual, monocultural English, and how that often closed down opportunities for students. And I really worked alongside teachers to see how through their own practice, they were actually creating opportunities, spaces for multilingual learners to use their languages and their cultures to scaffold their learning. And it was also interesting to look at teachers and their own identities and their own trajectories as people, and their own kind of how that fed into their practice. I mean, so there's that connection between identities and their own kind of practice within their classrooms that is important also here. So that's kind of sort of how I, in a very, very simplistic way, what my kind of direction of travel has been so far. And what's been interesting in this paper is working in a different context like Spain, working within schools and working alongside these two teachers that are represented in the paper and trying to understand how they are involved in this kind of process of the globalizing of English and the bilingual programs in Spain, how they are also players in all of this.
Okay. It's really interesting. So we've got a sense there of some of the importance of language and of identities, and how you've got to this point of looking at teacher identities. So you did look at the identities of the teachers in this instance, but you also then looked at their trajectories. So that's a step further in a way. And I wonder, I'm going to move us on a little bit to talk about, because I know that your work is framing these trajectories and these identities within the wider sort of macro processes, and in this case, particularly the globalization of English and the hegemonic and structural influences. So I wondered how, if you could talk about that a little bit, and in relation perhaps to teacher identity, teacher trajectories that come up in this paper, and that is sort of, I can see that there's been a journey there from talking about those influences on student identities and trajectories to the teachers.
Sure. I mean, we had 3 specific questions that we lay out in the paper. We wanted to look at CLIL teachers and how their social, linguistic, and gendered identities shape their sense of self and positioning as professionals. That was one of the questions we were looking at. We want to look at kind of how they performed those identities, so how they were becoming and enacting their clear identities as teachers in their everyday working lives. So the second question really focused on how they managed or negotiated and resisted the different identities discursively, and how they were positioned within these unequal relations of power, and also how they exercise their agency as professionals in relation to their everyday practices. So, we're looking at, as you've pointed out, those macro discourses that were being reproduced institutionally. So like I said earlier, all of a sudden schools were had these bilingual programs, and they were offering these programs, and this was reshaping the sorts of practices and professional positioning of teachers within the school. So there were a lot of kind of politics and different kind of jockeying for positions as CLIL teachers. It also kind of reshaped people's identities as professionals. So these teachers were positioning themselves in a much more privileged position, because they had a level of English that allowed them to be part of these programs. But at the same time, they were also having to resist and manage these identities imposed by the institutions themselves, you know, you're now a CLIL teacher, so therefore you've got to do this. Esteban talks about in the paper about how it felt like it was overnight that all of a sudden, as a science physics teacher, he had to then teach through English. So while they were identified as being able to be CLIL teachers, and it was something that was valued, their English was being valued, they were also being positioned in a way that was kind of, I suppose they weren't, you know, part of what they talk about and part of what he talks about also is about the lack of support as well, the lack of kind of training support, the lack of assistance from the school itself to kind of be able to be a success as a CLIL teacher. You know, so this was something that was, that they struggled with. They had to manage, they had to resist, all sorts of different things within the politics of the school. They talk about also their own trajectories as English learners, and it's really quite interesting to still hear after many, many years of their learning of English and how they teach through English, that they still see themselves somehow in these kind of more inferior positions as English language users, which is always quite fascinating in a sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and what's really interesting as well, I think what you touched upon was the way in which this policy, which is intended obviously to deliver impact and change for learners, is having a significant impact on the teachers themselves and the way that they're viewing themselves. I wondered if there was something around how we could reflect on for us as researchers in education and migration. What can we learn about our own identity of working in the field, our own trajectories, and perhaps, I don't know, it might be an opportunity for you to discuss your own trajectory to some extent.
Sure. Just to go back to the paper, one of the other things, and I think this ties into the question you're asking now, one of the things we were also trying to do is, as you say, not just, I mean, we were highlighting the importance of this being and becoming, right? This concept of being and becoming, the way that your past, your present, and how you imagine yourself in the future impacts on the everyday practice of teaching. And also the emotional labor involved in this. This was something that was quite new to the discussion. We brought together all of this in this paper, and this kind of ties with the kind of advances in the work on teacher identities and language teacher identities in my field of applied linguistics. We're bringing together kind of not just what Barcusen calls the doing, the being and the doing, but the feeling, imagining, and the storying of teacher identities. And that's absolutely key. And it's about kind of emotions and the politics of emotions tied to representation that we're kind of trying to push forward. So going to your question about, you know, who we are as researchers, some other work that I've done has also been around researcher identities and how the discussion of, you know, being a researcher, and I did a special issue in 2011 around researcher identities. And as an ethnographer, you're often embedded in a field, in a context for a long period of time, and your investment also in that process and who you are and your own identities are important in the research that you do and the ways in which we kind of conceptualize the work that we do and what it means to be a researcher in the field, and how we are reflexive and how we position ourselves and how others position us. All of this is hugely important. And the emotional labor involved in doing research, which I think during the pandemic has been really, really important. And the way that the pandemic has reshaped how we do research, which we can get to in a moment. But I think my interest is around researcher identities has grown in the last several years, because I've started to think about myself and what I've brought from my own trajectories and my own social identities. How does that kind of impact the way I view the world and the way I've been positioned and what I bring to the research? And oftentimes as ethnographers, we're writing field notes, we're thinking about, issues around being an insider or an outsider. And one of the things we talk about is about our own kind of the politics of representation and our own position when we are doing research. And sometimes some of the discussions or reflections end up in the margins of our field notes. And I think one of the things that we were talking about in the special issue we did in 2011, and I did that with a colleague in Canada, was about how we need to bring those discussions out of the margins and into the frame, because these are important parts of how we kind of negotiate our own identities as researchers. We've got discourses that are imposed, that create identities that are imposed on us at various points of our kind of researcher trajectory. It could be because of institutional ethics and how we're supposed to be as researchers, or how we're, all sorts of different things that we're trained to kind of think about. And I think sometimes we need to kind of be, we need to sometimes really step back and kind of push some of these, resist some of these kind of positionalities. So
it's definitely a really interesting area. I know for myself that coming from a teaching background, just the practical lived experience of being in a classroom and then becoming a researcher, and then in the pandemic being in lockdown and having to leave fieldwork early and things like this, all impacting the impact on participants.
yeah.
Thank you very much for talking to us about your work, Frances. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time now, so I'm going to wrap up, unless you've got any concluding thoughts.
Well, thank you, Martin, for inviting me to be part of the Insights and Sounds series. I mean, it is kind of lovely to be able to kind of speak about my work and speak about aspects of my work. I mean, certainly if anyone's interested, I'm happy for people to get in touch and certainly look at some of the writing I've done around this. I mean, I suppose some of the other work I'm doing is continuing the kind of trajectory of work with teachers, because I've certainly been researching myself during the pandemic and having to rethink research practices. And I'm currently doing research with teachers and early years practitioners to look at how a toolkit that I've developed with a colleague is supporting their own development as researchers and doing in-house research. So that's something that is kind of in process at the moment. But yeah, so I suppose people can look at my web pages and see sort of how that work also develops in other writing I'm doing as well.
Yeah, well, we'll try and include some links, etc., for people to look at. But thanks very much for joining us, Frances, and good luck with your next projects.
Thank you very much.